The auction block stood under a cruel sun, its wooden boards darkened by years of sweat, blood, and tears. Maria Dilva, though that name had been taken from her along with everything else she owned, stood with her bare feet pressed against the burning wood. Her body shone like goods to a crowd of white men in straw hats and linen suits. She was only 17 years old, taken after a Quilombo raid deep in the interior of Bahia. Every part of her body cried out in silent defiance, even as heavy iron shackles dragged down her wrists. If this story touches you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We share untold histories of resistance and survival. Comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Your support helps keep these stories alive. The auctioneer's voice rolled through the thick, humid air of Salvador's busy trade district, listing her features as if she were an animal. Strong body, young age, fit for field labor or house service, healthy teeth, no clear flaws. His words faded into a dull echo as Maria locked her gaze on the jungle-covered hills beyond the city. Those green mountains carried secrets the white men would never know. She had been born among them, in a hidden community of escaped slaves who had built a life far from chains and whips. 3 weeks earlier, the militia had arrived with dogs and muskets, burning homes and dragging survivors back into the nightmare their parents had once escaped. The bidding opened at 200 mil race. A plantation owner from Reconcavo lifted his hand, his face flushed with heat and drink. Another offer came from a merchant needing laborers for his tobacco warehouse. Maria felt their eyes crawl over her skin, judging, measuring, turning her humanity into a number. She had watched her mother die during the Quilombo raid, shot through the chest as she tried to shield the children. She had seen her father dragged away in chains, sent toward the sugar plantations where men survived an average of 7 years before the work destroyed them. Now it was her turn to be sorted, sold, and condemned to a living death. The plantation owner won at 350 mil race. His name was Colonel Antonio Ferrer da Costa, owner of Engenho Santo Antonio, one of the largest sugar estates in the region. He stepped toward the platform with an owner's confidence, his boots striking the stone beneath him. Up close, Maria saw cruelty carved into the lines around his mouth and casual violence in the way he held his riding crop. He nodded to the auctioneer's assistant, who removed her shackles only to fasten a rope around her neck, leading her like an animal toward a wagon where 6 other newly bought slaves sat in stunned silence. The journey to Engenho Santo Antonio lasted 3 days. They rode in a covered wagon that reeked of fear and unwashed bodies, stopping only briefly for water and cassava bread. Maria memorized every mark along the road, the curve of the river, the stand of jacaranda trees, the abandoned chapel with its broken walls. She knew survival depended on knowing the land, understanding the paths that led away from captivity and toward the thick Atlantic forest still covering much of the interior. Her grandmother had taught her the forest's ways long before the militia came. These lessons were passed down from ancestors who survived the Middle Passage and refused to accept slavery as destiny. Engenho Santo Antonio spread across hundreds of hectares, a factory of pain hidden behind the mask of agricultural success. The big house rested on a hill above the cane fields, its whitewashed walls shining in the afternoon sun, while the senzala, the slave quarters, crouched in the valley below, made of tight wooden huts with dirt floors and no why. Endaus, the overseer, a Portuguese man named Gonzalo, who enjoyed creative cruelty, placed Maria among the house servants instead of the fields. Colonel Costa had particular plans for young women, and field labor would ruin the smooth skin and soft hands he desired. Maria's first duty was serving dinner to the colonel and his guests, wealthy landowners who gathered to discuss crop yields and slave prices while being waited on by people they called property. She moved quietly around the long mahogany table, pouring wine and placing roasted meats, her face carefully empty as talk filled the room about better ways to increase production through fear. One guest bragged about a system where slaves who missed quotas were whipped before everyone. Another suggested breaking families apart to stop emotional bonds that might lead to rebellion. The colonel agreed calmly, sipping imported Portuguese wine while Maria's hands shook with tightly held rage. At night, locked inside the senzala with other enslaved people, Maria listened to whispered stories of resistance. There was João, who had tried to escape twice and carried the scars across his back. There was old Benedita, who remembered the Quilombo of Palmares and spoke of it like a lost heaven. There was young Pedro, whose brother had escaped 6 months earlier and was rumored to be living with a maroon group deep in the forest. These stories became Maria's breath in a place designed to choke hope. She learned which guards drank until they slept, which dogs could be distracted with scraps, which paths through the cane led toward the tree line. On the 8th night, the colonel's attention turned fully to her. He called her to his private study after the house fell quiet, his intentions clear as he dismissed the other servants and locked the door. Maria had known this moment would come. She had heard the warnings, seen the hollow eyes of women summoned before her. Knowing did not make it easier. When he stepped closer, why? The confidence of a man who believed he owned her labor, her body, her dignity, and her soul. What Colonel Costa did not understand was that Maria came from warriors. Her great-grandmother had been a Dahomey fighter before capture and shipment across the ocean. Her grandmother had killed 2 slave hunters during the escape that founded their quilombo. Her mother died fighting rather than surrendering. Violence was not new to Maria. It was her inheritance, held tightly, always ready to burn. She waited until he came near, his wine-soaked breath heavy, his hands reaching for her clothes. Then she moved with the speed her grandmother had trained into her in the mountains. Her fingers closed around the letter opener on his desk, a silver blade with a mother-of-pearl handle, decorative but sharp enough. The colonel's eyes widened as she drove it into the soft flesh beneath his ribs, angling upward toward his heart with practiced precision learned from hunting in the forest. He made a choking sound and stumbled back, blood spreading across his white shirt. Maria watched him fall and felt fierce satisfaction at the shock on his face, the disbelief that one of his possessions had struck back. She knew what would follow: no trial, no mercy, only torture and public execution to warn others. But she also knew one more thing: she would not be there when they came. The study window opened onto a first-floor veranda overlooking the gardens. Maria climbed through without looking back, her hands slick with blood. The night air struck her face like a blessing as she dropped and ran toward the slave quarters. She needed supplies, food, a blade, anything useful. The senzala was dark and quiet, its people crushed by 16-hour days. Benedita was awake, her old eyes shining. Without a word, she pressed a small bundle into Maria's hands: dried meat, cassava flour, a water skin, and fast whispered directions about forest paths and a river 3 days north where maroon scouts sometimes guided escapees to safety. "Run like your grandmother ran," Benedita whispered. "Run like every ancestor is pushing your feet. If they catch you, die fighting. Better dead than broken." Maria hugged her once and slipped into the night. The grounds of Engenho Santo Antonio were wide, but she had mapped them during her days of service, memorizing guard posts and weak patrol points. She moved like a shadow through the cane, the tall stalks hiding her as she reached the forest edge. Behind her, the big house stayed silent. Hours would pass before the body was found, hours she needed to put distance between herself and pursuit. The forest greeted her with the smell of wet earth and living things. Maria disappeared into the undergrowth, ignoring branches tearing her thin dress and skin. She had grown up here and knew its dangers and rhythms. The men who would hunt her were children of plantations and cities. Uneasy in the wild they tried to tame. That fear would be her strength. She ran through the night, guided by starlight filtering through the leaves and the deep knowledge of the land carried in her bones, every sound sharp in her ears, every breath pushing her farther toward freedom. The thick undergrowth, the faraway barking of dogs that might or might not be following her scent. Still, she did not stop. She pushed her body past exhaustion, driven by fear on one side and fierce resolve on the other. Behind her waited pain and death. In front of her was the chance of freedom, narrow and uncertain, yet real enough to keep her legs moving. When dawn arrived, she was far from the plantation, deep inside the Atlantic forest, where trees grew so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground. She stopped at a stream to drink and to wash the colonel's blood from her hands, watching the water carry away proof of what she had done. Her reflection stared back at her, a young woman changed by violence and flight. Her eyes were hard with purpose, her jaw tight with resolve. She was no longer Maria Dilva, owned by Colonel Antonio Ferreira di Costa. She was a fugitive, a killer, a woman who had chosen death rather than submission, and who would now fight for every breath of free air. The chase would start soon. She imagined what would happen at Engenho Santo Antonio. A servant would find the colonel's body, alarms would be raised, and the overseer Gonzalo would gather men with dogs and guns. They would follow her trail to the edge of the forest and pause, afraid of its size and danger. But fear would not stop them. The killing of a white landowner by an enslaved woman could never be forgiven. Not in a society built on total control. They would hunt her with the anger of men who felt their whole world threatened by one girl refusing her assigned place. Maria steadied herself and kept moving north, following Benedita's instructions toward the river. She now traveled in daylight, believing speed mattered more than hiding. Every hour was more distant. CE from her pursuers, another step closer to the rumored maroon communities hidden deep in the forest. As she walked, she gathered food, wild fruit and edible roots to add to what Benedita had given her. The forest rewarded those who understood it, and Maria's grandmother had taught her well. On the second day, she heard the dogs. Their howls echoed through the trees, far away but clear. The hunters had entered the forest, following her trail with grim focus. They knew what was at risk. If she escaped, if people learned that an enslaved woman could kill her master and disappear into the jungle, others would be inspired. The whole system depended on the idea that white power could not be challenged, that resistance always ended in capture and death. Maria was proof that this belief could break, and small cracks could bring down everything. She walked faster, ignoring the pain in her feet and the deep tiredness that made each step feel like moving through thick water. All day the dogs me closer, pushed hard by their handlers. As the sun began to sink, Maria reached the river. She found a shallow place and crossed, knowing the water would confuse the dogs for a while. On the far bank, she stopped to breathe and think. They were close, too close. She needed to find the maroon scouts Benedita had spoken of, or find a way to stop the hunters for good. The forest grew darker and heavier as she went deeper inside. This was ancient forest, older than Portuguese rule, where massive trees formed a roof so thick that the ground lived in constant shadow. Maria felt something old watching, something that had seen countless human struggles and did not care. She whispered prayers to her ancestors and the Orishas, asking for protection, sensing the forest answer in small changes of wind and shadow. The hunting group had 8 men, 6 Portuguese overseers and militia, and 2 enslaved trackers promised freedom if they brought Maria back alive. They moved badly through the forest, unused to the land, their fine boots sinking into mud, their linen clothes soaked with sweat. Gonzalo led them, his face hard with anger since the colonel's body was found. He had served Antonio Ferreira de Costa for 12 years and had built his name on strict order at Inenjo Santo Antonio. Now a 17-year-old girl had ruined that reputation with one act of defiance. The dogs pulled at their leashes, trained to hunt runaways anywhere. They had followed Maria's scent into the forest, noses low, barking to guide their handlers, but the river had confused them. On the far bank they circled, whining in frustration. Gonzalo swore and sent the trackers ahead. Tomas and Gabriel moved forward, reading signs no European could see. Tomas knelt and studied the mud and broken plants. "She crossed here," he said softly. 3, maybe 4 hours ago. She was moving fast, but she's tired. Her steps are shorter now. He pointed at marks in the soft earth and looked into the dark canopy with a low. At mixed concern and thought, Gabriel stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the trees, uneasy. They knew the stories, whispered tales of fugitives who vanished into the forest, of maroon villages guarded by spirits and violence, of white hunters who never returned. The forest was not neutral. It belonged to those who understood it, and that was often the escaped. They crossed the river as night fully fell. The dogs found the scent again. Gonzalo forced them onward despite the danger. He had sent word for militia help, but pride and rage pushed him to continue. He wanted to capture the girl himself and oversee her punishment, to remind everyone of the order he believed in. To him, this was not only about one escape. It was about protecting the power that defined his life. Maria heard them long before she saw them. She had climbed a huge fig tree, using its thick roots and branches to hide. From above, she watched the hunters pass below. Their torches threw shaking light, twisting their faces into harsh shapes. She counted their weapons, 4 muskets, pistols, knives, and machetes. A direct fight was impossible, but the forest could help her if she used it well. She waited until they passed, then climbed down silently and moved alongside them, staying hidden but close enough to watch. A plan began to take shape, risky and desperate, but no worse than being cornered later. Her grandmother had told stories of Quilombo defenders who turned the forest into a weapon. The white men saw trees and darkness as problems. Maria saw them as tools. 2 hours after midnight, the hunters stopped in a small clearing. They were exhausted, the night making travel dangerous even with firelight. Gonzalo set 2 guards and let the others rest, though he stayed awake, thinking of punishment. The dogs were tied to a tree, alert but tired. Maria watched, learning the guard patterns. One guard was young, new to the plantation, still uneasy with violence. The other was older, marked by past rebellions, always ready for attack. The younger man was the weakness, but she needed a distraction. She moved upwind of the dogs, cut her palm lightly, and let blood drip onto leaves and bark. She scattered these pieces away from camp, making a false trail. Then she bent a green branch into a simple trap using a leather cord. It would not kill, but it would hurt and cause confusion. The dogs caught the blood scent and began barking wildly. The camp burst into motion. Gonzalo shouted orders, sending 3 men to investigate. Maria waited as they followed the false trail, torches bouncing. The moment came when the young guard turned away to light a cigarette, blinded by the fire. Maria moved fast and silent, crossed the distance in seconds, covered his mouth and drove her knife into his throat, the blade cutting deep as his body went slack. He struck the artery with precise force. A wet, choking gurgle escaped the man's throat as he collapsed, his torch slipping from his hand, hitting the dirt and going dark. Maria caught his musket before it could clatter loudly and stepped back into the shadows before the older guard could fully understand what had happened. The scream, when it finally came, rose from the forest, right where her trap had been set. One of the men chasing her had stumbled into the bent sapling. It snapped forward and slammed into his face with enough strength to break his nose and possibly crack his cheekbone as well. His companion shouted in panic, his voice echoing through the trees and spreading confusion about where the real danger was. Maria did not stop to watch the outcome. She was already moving farther into the forest, creating distance between herself and the disorder she had unleashed. Behind her, the camp dissolved into fearful violence as the remaining men fired muskets into the darkness, convinced they were being attacked from all sides. She heard Gonzalo yelling for discipline, heard the dogs barking wildly, heard men crashing through brush in blind fear. But she also heard something else. A low whistle, 3 notes falling downward, came from somewhere to her left. Maria stopped cold, her heart pounding hard. She knew that whistle. It was a columbombo signal her grandmother had taught her long ago. It meant, "Friend, this way, hurry." She turned toward the sound and almost immediately saw a shape separate itself from the darkness. It was a young man, no more than 20, with ritual scars cut into his cheeks and a blowgun held ready in his hands. He waved urgently for her to follow. They ran together through the fading night. The Quilombola scout moved with the calm certainty of someone walking land that belonged to him. Behind them, the noise of pursuit began to organize itself. Gonzalo had regained control and was guiding his men toward the source of the gunfire and confusion. But the scout led Maria through ground that seemed made to defeat trackers. They crossed streams that erased footprints, passed over bare row that left no sign at all, and pushed through thick growth that closed behind them like a door. As dawn broke, painting the canopy with gold and green light, the scout finally slowed and spoke. His Portuguese carried the sound of someone who had learned it after mastering another language. "My name is Kwame. We have been watching the plantation, waiting for those who escape. When word spread yesterday about the colonel's death, we knew someone would come this way." He gave a thin, serious smile. "We did not expect you to kill one man and wound another. The spirits walk with you." Maria felt some of the tightness leave her body, though she knew safety was not yet certain. "How far to your people?" she asked, her voice rough after 2 days of near silence. 2 more days, Kwame replied. "They will not follow much farther. This forest is ours now, and they know it. 3 months ago, a militia captain and 4 soldiers came here hunting refugees. Only one returned, and his mind was broken by what he saw. The white men tell stories about us now. They say the forest itself eats those who come looking for slaves." He paused. "Some of those stories are true. They traveled through the day at a steady pace, covering ground without wasting strength. Kwame stopped at intervals to mark trees, signs meant for other Quilombola scouts. The marks warned that someone was being guided in and that the path needed watching. He showed Maria how to read and make these signs, explaining the quiet network that allowed their people to share warnings and plan responses across great distances. "We are not one village," he said as they rested beside a stream at midday. "We are many. We are linked by paths only we know, protected by knowledge the colonizers cannot take. When they destroy one place, we have already built 3 more. When they hunt us, we strike back until the cost is too high and they pull away. We do not only survive, we resist." Behind them, the hunters had stopped. Gonzalo stood at the edge of land that made his instinct scream danger. The forest ahead seemed darker, heavier, more alive with every step forward. They had lost 3 men in a single night. One lay dead with his throat cut. One was injured by a trap. One vanished in the chaos and was found at dawn with a poisoned dart in his neck. The trackers refused to continue. Their fear of the Quilombolas was stronger than their fear of punishment. "She is protected now," Tomas said quietly, avoiding Gonzalo's gaze. "The forest has taken her. If we go on, we will not come back." Gonzalo wanted to argue. He wanted to push forward out of pride alone. But he was practical enough to see defeat. The girl was gone, swallowed by the same wilderness that had hidden thousands of others before her. He could not report success, but he could report effort and danger and land too hostile for pursuit. The authorities would be angry, but they would understand. Some fights could not be won. Some rebellions could never be fully crushed. Control survived on illusion, while resistance lived just beyond reach. The party turned back, carrying their dead and wounded, leaving Maria to the forest and whatever future waited inside it. As they crossed the river again, Gonzalo thought of the colonel's family, who would demand revenge. Let them hire their own trackers, he thought bitterly. Let them send their sons to die. Honor had been served. Survival meant knowing when to retreat. Maria and Kwame traveled through afternoon into night, stopping at a hidden camp where 2 other scouts waited with food and water. They greeted Maria with respectful nods, seeing in her a woman who had struck her oppressor and lived. They shared roasted monkey meat and cassava, and one scout brought out a small clay pot of palm wine to mark her escape. "You will need a new name," Kwame said as they ate. "Maria da Silva died on that plantation, beside the colonel's body. Here you chose who you become." He motioned to the forest. "This place allows your spirit to decide." Maria thought as she chewed, exhaustion finally reaching her after 3 days of running and violence. Her grandmother had carried a name from before slavery, a word of strength. Her mother had chosen Zuri, meaning beautiful and free. Maria wanted a name that honored them and marked her change. "Adora," she said at last. "It means daughter of the people. I belong to all who resisted, all who refused chains." Kwame smiled and lifted his cup. "Adora, welcome to the free people. Tomorrow you will see Quilombo Palmares Novo, 300 souls living as humans should, without masters." That night, sleeping on soft moss beneath ancient trees, she dreamed of her mother and grandmother standing in golden light. They said nothing, but pride shone on their faces. She had honored them. She had chosen death over submission and found freedom. When dawn came and the forest woke around her, she felt something she had not felt since childhood. Hope. This warning matters, even with the added risk. "Welcome, Adawara. You have earned your place here." The move into Quilombo life unfolded faster than Adawara had imagined. In just a few days, she was placed in a shared house with 5 other women. Each one carried her own escape story. Each one held deep trauma that surfaced as night terrors, sharp fear, and sudden panic. They leaned on one another with a fierce loyalty born from shared understanding, knowing that survival depended on community, and that personal freedom meant nothing without shared safety. Adawara learned the daily rhythms of life. She helped care for hidden gardens, prepared manioc root, wove baskets, cleaned and maintained weapons, and trained in combat styles that blended African martial traditions with methods shaped for guerrilla resistance against slave hunters. The success of the Quilombo relied on many layers of protection. The outer ring was formed by scouts like Ikwame, who watched the paths from plantation lands and sent warnings of danger. The second layer used false trails and planned dead ends meant to confuse and wear down pursuers. The third layer was the people themselves. Every adult was trained to fight and ready to defend freedom with deadly force if needed. The final layer was spiritual. Ceremonies called on the orishas and the ancestors, forming what the residents believed to be a shield that bent hostile intentions back onto the enemy. Adewora joined her first ceremony during her second week in Palmaris Novo. It happened at night in a sacred grove marked with ritual items, cowrie shells, iron tools, and carved wooden figure that represented different orishas. Yatunde led the ritual, her voice rising and falling in songs that blended Yoruba and Fon languages, calling on Ogun, the warrior spirit, and Oya, the force of change and wind. Drums set rhythms that matched heartbeats, while dancers moved in patterns that told stories of struggle and survival. During the ceremony, Adewora felt something shift inside her, as if generations of ancestors had noticed her choice and welcomed her into a long line of fighters. Still, the Quilombo was no paradise. It lived under constant threat, always one betrayal or one serious militia raid away from ruin. Supplies were scarce. Medical care was basic, far worse than the plantation infirmary she had once known. The mental strain of living as permanent fugitives weighed heavily on everyone. Arguments broke out over how food was shared, how defenses should be handled, and whether helping newly escaped slaves was worth the danger of exposure. Adewora watched these disputes, and slowly understood that freedom did not mean a life without hardship, but the right to face hardship without someone else controlling you. 3 months after she arrived, news spread through the scout network that changed everything. A Portuguese militia captain named Duarte Quio had been assigned to destroy Palmaris Novo. He commanded 50 soldiers and offered large rewards to anyone willing to betray Quilombo locations. Unlike earlier leaders, Quio was careful and patient. He built an informant system among enslaved people still on plantations, offering freedom papers in exchange for usable information. Several smaller Quilombos had already been wiped out. Their people were killed or dragged back into bondage. Quio's forces were slowly mapping the forest, erasing safe places one by one. This moment matters in our story. It shows that freedom must always be defended against those who profit from slavery. If Adewora's journey moves you, please subscribe to the channel and press like. Share this story with others who need to hear about resistance. Leave a comment and tell us what freedom means in your own life. Yatunde C. Old, a full community council to decide what to do. The debate was fierce and exposed deep divides. Some wanted to abandon Palmaris Novo and rebuild deeper in the forest, believing that caution was the key to survival. Others demanded a stand and a fight, arguing that retreat only delayed destruction and that crushing Quio's forces would send a powerful warning. A third group suggested a middle approach, striking at Quio's supply lines and informants to make his campaign too costly to continue. Adewora found herself siding with those who wanted to fight. Her voice carried weight because she had already proven she was willing to use violence against oppressors. "They will never stop hunting us," she said during a heated meeting. "We can run deeper into the forest, but one day the forest ends. We can hide better, but someone will always sell us out for the right reward. If we want to live, we must make hunting us more expensive than leaving us alone. We must become hunters, not prey." Her words struck the younger members most deeply, those born free or newly escaped, still burning with anger over their captivity. Yatunde and the elders saw it differently. Every victory drew more attention, more soldiers, more resources aimed at destruction. The longest-lasting quilombos were the ones that stayed unseen, blending so fully into the forest that colonial powers forgot them. Palmaris Novo had survived 15 years through invisibility, not open battle. The argument ended when scouts reported that Quio's men had captured and tortured a guide who knew the general area of Palmaris Novo. The militia was 3 days away and advancing with confidence, bringing soldiers and enslaved laborers forced to carry supplies and clear paths. The chance for a quiet escape was gone. The community now faced a hard choice: fight or scatter and hope to reunite later. Yatunde made the decision with the authority of someone who had kept hundreds alive through years of danger. "We fight," she said. "But we fight smart. We use the forest. We make them pay for every step. When the cost becomes too high, they will turn back, and we will gain time. Time to build new sanctuaries. Time to spread word that Quilombos can defend themselves. Time for more slaves to escape and join us." Preparation turned Palmaris Novo from a village into a fortress. Fighters set defensive lines along the approach routes, each meant to cause damage and then fall back to the next. Traps filled the forest, covered spike pits, bent trees that launched sharpened stakes, hidden snares meant to cripple or kill. Kofi, the community blacksmith who had worked metal before enslavement, forged hundreds of arrowheads and spear tips. Women crushed poison from forest plants and carefully coated each weapon. Adawara was placed on the first defensive line, the one that would face the initial attack. She accepted without complaint, knowing her newness meant she had more to prove. She was assigned to a squad with 4 OT. Hers, 2 men and 2 women, all veterans of past clashes. They chose a narrow ridge where the militia would be forced to pass, with clear lines of fire and multiple escape routes. The waiting was worse than she had expected. For 2 days they stayed hidden, eating cold food, sleeping little, always alert. The pressure of knowing violence was coming but not when, stretched time into something tight and unreal. Adawara checked her weapons again and again, her bow with 20 poison-tipped arrows, her machete, her knife for the final moment. She thought of her grandmother and the long road that had led from a quiet childhood Quilombo to this coming battle. The militia arrived on the 3rd morning, moving with confidence born of numbers and guns. 50 soldiers in Portuguese uniforms marched in, followed by 20 enslaved laborers carrying gear and supplies. Captain Duarte Kio rode a horse forced through the rough terrain. His uniform stayed sharp despite the heat, his posture that of a man who had never lost to escaped slaves. He believed victory was certain. He had muskets against bows, numbers against a small settlement, and the backing of colonial power. What he did not know was that the forest had already chosen a side. The defenders knew every tree, every stone, every hidden dip in the land. They read warnings in the sudden quiet of birds and insects. They fought not for pay or rank, but to exist free. That need made them more dangerous than trained soldiers. Adawara's squad let the front scouts pass, waiting until the main force entered the kill zone. Then Ikwame gave the signal, 3 sharp bird calls, sounding natural to Outsi. Durs, but meaning fire. 20 arrows flew at once. Poison tips struck necks, chests, arms. Men screamed and collapsed as the toxin worked fast. Formation shattered into panic as soldiers scrambled for cover and searched for enemies they could not see. Kio shouted commands, trying to regain control, sending squads to press forward as chaos spread. Arrows flanked the hidden defenders. Then more arrows flew from different places, giving the sense that attackers were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The enslaved laborers saw their chance. They dropped what they were carrying and ran into the forest. Some ran toward the Quilombo to join the defenders. Others ran simply to escape the violence. 3 soldiers managed to fire their muskets toward where they believed Adawara was hiding, but the thick smoke from the powder and the dense plants made careful aiming impossible. Adawara loosed her last arrow and gave the signal to pull back, following a planned route that led to a second defensive point. Her group disappeared into the forest, moving fast and using their deep knowledge of the land to stay ahead of anyone chasing them. Behind them, the militia spent about 15 minutes securing the area and tending to their wounded. They found 8 men dead and 12 injured, a shocking loss from a clash that had lasted no more than 2 minutes. The same pattern happened 3 more times during the day. At each position, the defenders caused damage, spread fear and confusion, and then vanished before the militia could use their greater numbers. By nightfall, Quelho had lost 20 men killed and another 15 too badly hurt to keep fighting. He ordered his men to make camp in a defensive formation, placing strong guards around the area. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by grim resolve and the growing realization that he had badly underestimated his enemy. The night belonged to the Quilombolas. Quelho's tired soldiers stayed close to their fires, jumping at every sound that came from the dark forest. Adawara and the other defenders moved like spirits among the trees surrounding the camp. They did not attack openly. That would have meant certain death against alert sentries with loaded muskets. Instead, they made sure the soldiers felt their presence in ways meant to break nerves and crush morale. Soft voices speaking Portuguese drifted through the shadows, seeming to come from all directions at once. Go home. This forest will be your grave. Your families will never know what happened to you. Strange noises echoed through the trees, drumming that might have been ritual or might have been a way to send signals. Animal calls that sounded almost real but not quite right. Branches snapping, suggesting movement, but showing nothing when soldiers went to check. Adawara took part in this mental warfare with dark satisfaction. She understood that fear could be as deadly as poisoned arrows. These soldiers were far from home, fighting enemies they could not see, in land they did not understand. Every hour without sleep weakened them for the fighting to come the next day. One soldier, younger than the rest and clearly terrified, tried to desert around midnight. He stood up from his post, dropped his musket, and walked straight into the forest as if under a spell. The sentries shouted after him, but he did not answer or turn around. They heard him pushing through the brush for about 5 minutes, and then there was silence. He was never seen again. Whether he was killed, became lost, or somehow escaped, no one ever knew. But his disappearance sent waves of fear through the remaining troops. Captain Quao knew he was losing his grip on his men at dawn. He gathered his sergeants and explained a new plan. They would stop trying to find Palmares Novo itself. Instead, they would destroy the Quilombo's means of survival. They would burn gardens, poison water sources, and build a permanent post at the edge of the forest to block new refugees from reaching the maroon communities. We cannot catch them in this wilderness, he admitted coldly, but we can make it impossible for them to live. We can starve them out. The militia pulled back at first light, moving in tight ranks with scouts ahead and guards behind, expecting attacks that never came. The Quilombola defenders let them leave, having achieved what they needed. The community remained hidden, and the cost of hunting them had been made painfully clear. But as the soldiers withdrew, they followed Quao's orders. They burned every secret garden they found, fouled streams with dead animals, and marked paths for future missions. Adawara watched smoke rise from the destroyed crops, her heart sinking. They had won the fight, but might have lost something even more vital, the foundations that kept them alive. That evening, Yetunde called another council. The mood was heavy despite the battlefield success. Scouts reported that Quao was building a fort at the forest's edge, St. Aft with 20 soldiers and stocked for a long stay. The meaning was obvious. The colonial powers were shifting from quick strikes to constant pressure. We can plant again, Yetunde said calmly. We can find new water, but Kolu is right. Our safety margin is very small. We must think about spreading out, breaking into smaller groups, creating several settlements across a wider area. If one is found, the others can survive. She paused and looked around at the faces lit by firelight. We also need stronger ties with other Quilombos, sharing supplies and information. Being isolated kept us hidden, but it also made us weak. The choice to divide the community was painful. Families who had lived together for years would be separated and sent to different places to improve their chances of survival. Adawara was placed in a group of 30 people assigned to start a new settlement 4 days' journey to the northeast. Scouts said the land there looked promising, though it had not yet been explored. Wayne would lead them, bringing his hard-earned experience and deep knowledge of life in the forest. Before they left, Yetunde took Adawara aside to speak with her alone. You have only been with us for 4 months, she said, but you have proven yourself in ways that truly matter. I want you to understand what you are part of now. Not just one Quilombo, but a movement. Across Brazil, she continued, there are hundreds of communities like ours, thousands of people living free in the spaces the colonizers cannot fully control. We send messengers, share news and supplies, and plan resistance together. You killed Colonel Costa thinking only of survival, but that act became something bigger, a symbol that gives others hope. She handed Adawara a small leather pouch filled with seeds, maize, beans, and manioc cuttings, the living base of a new community. Where you are going, you will help build life from nothing. It will be harder than anything you have known. There will be hunger, sickness, arguments, and moments when quitting feels sensible. But remember why we do this. Every free day is a victory over a system that claims to own us. Our very existence proves their lies. We are not property. We are not animals. We are human beings claiming what is ours by birth. Adawara's group left 3 days later, carrying everything they needed to survive until they could plant crops and mark hunting grounds. The journey was brutal. They moved through the thickest parts of the Atlantic forest, areas few Europeans had ever entered. Progress was slow, with constant scouting, knowing Quao's new fort meant more patrols nearby. Along the way they saw signs of other Quilombos, carved trees, hidden supply caches, quiet proof that others had passed through and survived. On the 5th day they found something they did not expect. A small indigenous community of about 20 people, from a group Wayne recognized as Tupinambá, driven inland by Portuguese expansion along the coast. The first meeting was tense, with both sides wary, But understanding grew through broken Portuguese gestures and shared hardship. These people were refugees too, resisting the same forces, trying to live in a shrinking wild land. Over the next days, a natural alliance formed. The Tupinambá knew the land deeply. They understood which plants healed and which killed, where animals could be hunted, and where dangerous predators lived. In return, the Quilombola group shared knowledge of Portuguese weapons, soldier behavior, and troop movements. They chose to build nearby settlements, close enough to defend one another, but separate enough to keep their cultures intact. The place they selected was ideal, a hidden valley with a clear spring, ringed by ridges that offered protection and many escape paths. The valley floor was flat and good for farming, and the forest around it provided everything else they needed. Work began at once, first with simple shelters, then stronger homes. Adewora threw herself into the labor. For the first time in a long while, she felt the quiet satisfaction of creating instead of destroying, of building a future instead of running from the past. But the past did not release her so easily. 6 weeks after the settlement was founded, a messenger arrived from Palmares Novo with troubling news. A Portuguese trader in Salvador had announced a huge reward, 5,000 mil race for information, leading to the capture of the black woman who killed Colonel Antonio Ferreira da Costa. The description was too precise to come from anyone who had not seen Adewora on the plantation. Costa's family was rich and powerful, and they wanted revenge even more than they wanted lost property. 5,000 mil reis was a fortune, enough to buy freedom for an entire family, enough to buy land and start a legal business, enough to tempt even loyal members toward betrayal. The messenger said fear and suspicion was spreading through established communities. People watched one another, her closely, wondering who might be desperate or greedy enough to sell information to the colonizers. Yatunde's response would soon shape what came next. Punctuation delivered through the messenger was plain and practical. Adewora could not go back to Palmares Novo or to any known Quilombo. Her presence there would endanger everyone, yet casting her away was also not an option. She was one of them, and they protected their own. The new settlement had to stay hidden from everyone except a trusted few. No visitors were allowed, no messengers unless they were clearly approved. Total isolation was required until the bounty was removed or slowly faded from memory. The isolation proved more difficult than the hard physical labor of building the settlement. Adora had known true community at Palmares Novo. She had felt the mental comfort of being surrounded by people who understood her past and shared her beliefs. Now that sense of belonging was gone, replaced by a much smaller group who did know her story and treated her with tired respect instead of warmth. She spent many long hours working alone in the gardens or hunting in the forest, choosing solitude over the complicated social ties of the new settlement. On one of these lone hunting trips, Adara came across something that changed how she understood the dangers of the region. She discovered a skeleton, clearly European, identified by the remains of a Portuguese military uniform, hanging from a tree in a deliberate display. The bones were arranged in patterns that suggested ritual meaning, and nearby trees were marked with symbols she did not recognize. This was not the work of quilombolas or indigenous people protecting their land. This was something different, something older and harder to explain. When she reported what she had seen to Wame and the Tupinambá elders, their reactions said much. The indigenous leaders exchanged looks and spoke quickly in their own language before one of them addressed the group. "Yuha, we've found the edge of the forbidden zone," he said in rough Portuguese. "There are places in this forest where neither the Portuguese nor escaped slaves nor our own people go. These lands belong to old spirits from before humans arrived. That soldier was left as a warning. Some lands demand respect, not conquest." Wami remained doubtful but practical. "Whatever the truth is," he said, "that area gives us natural protection. No militia will chase us past a place where their own men have vanished. We should mark it clearly and make sure everyone here knows never to cross it." Still, Adora felt drawn to that boundary in the weeks that followed, not to step beyond it, but to understand it. She would sit at the edge of the forbidden area and sense something there, a presence, an awareness, the feeling of being watched by a consciousness older than colonial rule and certain to last beyond it. Her grandmother had spoken of such places in Africa, sacred groves where the Orishas lived, where humans ent, arid only with the right rituals and respect. Maybe this new land had its own sacred spaces. its own spirits quietly observing human struggle with endless patience. The settlement expanded through the dry season. When the rains returned, they had cleared 3 acres of gardens, built 20 solid structures, and formed a strong bond with the Tupinambá community. Children born free played together, learning both African and indigenous languages, forming a mixed culture that fully belonged to neither tradition, yet gained strength from both. Adara watched these children with mixed feelings. They stood for hope and a future, but also for risk, lives that would need protection in a world that still saw them as property or problems to be erased. 8 months after the settlement was founded, scouts brought news that Captain Coelho had been called back to Salvador. His campaign against the Quilombos was judged too costly for the results. The garrison at the forest edge was reduced to a token foe, RCE, and attention shifted elsewhere. There were indigenous uprisings on the frontier, conflicts with the Dutch in the northeast, and constant pressure to keep plantations running despite labor shortages. The Quilombos had not won through a great battle, but through stubborn endurance, by making their capture more trouble than it was worth. The news should have brought comfort, but Ada felt only deep exhaustion. The bounty on her head still stood, and memories lasted long in a society built on honor and revenge. She would never return to the coast, never walk freely through colonial towns, never stop watching for betrayal from unexpected places. She now understood that freedom was not an endpoint. It was a constant struggle, an ongoing negotiation with forces that wanted to reclaim her body and crush her spirit. 3 years passed in the hidden valley. 3 years that changed Adawara from a hunted fugitive into a leader, from someone running from bondage into someone creating alternate lives to it. The settlement grew to 70 people, including escaped slaves who arrived through secret routes, indigenous refugees displaced from the coast, and 13 children born free, who knew chains only as stories shared by firelight. Adawara became the settlement's main war leader, responsible for defense planning and for training every able adult in combat methods that blended African martial traditions with indigenous forest warfare. The bounty still existed, though it weakened as time passed and the Costa family lost influence. Colonel Antonio's widow remarried and moved to Portugal, taking her obsession with revenge with her. His sons inherited the plantation but lacked their father's cruel skill. In Gino Santo Antonio, the estate slowly declined as poor management and slave resistance destroyed its profits. Still, 5,000 milrays remained a powerful temptation, and Adawara knew that someone, somewhere, might decide that money mattered more than loyalty. The greatest danger did not come from colonial forces, but from within the Colombo network itself. One morning, a man named Vicente arrived at the settlement, claiming to be a messenger from Palmares Novo, with news of coordinated actions against slave hunters. He was welcomed carefully, given food and shelter according to Colombo customs. Yet something about him unsettled Adora. His eyes measured defenses, his questions focused on numbers and supplies, and his story contained small mistakes about people and places in Palmares Novo. That evening she shared her worries with Kwame. "He knows both too much and too little," she said quietly as they watched Vicente take a second serving of cassava stew. "He knows our customs well enough to enter, but not the people he claims sent him. When I mentioned Yatunde's son by name, he said he knew him. But Yatunde has only daughters." Kwame's expression grew hard. "Do you think he works for the Portuguese, or only for himself?" Adora answered softly. 5,000. Milrays can buy a lot of safety. Maybe he is an escaped slave who thinks turning me in is his best chance at security. Maybe he is a free man of color desperate enough to betray his own people. The reason does not matter. If he learns where this settlement is and that I am here, everyone is in danger." They watched Vicente closely over the next 2 days, noticing how he tried to draw Adawara into private conversations and asked about her past and how she arrived there. On the 3rd morning, he was gone. He had slipped away during the change of the night watch. The guards reported that he had headed northeast, not toward Palmares Novo, but toward the nearest colonial outpost, 2 days away through harsh terrain. Adawara decided at once, "I will follow him. If he reaches the garrison and reveals our location, we lose everything. This settlement, our alliance with the Tupinambá, maybe even the entire network if captured scouts are tortured for information. It is better to stop him now before the danger becomes real." She added that she would go alone, and if she failed or was captured, The settlement must evacuate immediately. Wami wanted to argue, but he understood the logic. You have 2 days to catch him, he said. After that, we assume the worst and begin evacuation. May the ancestors guide you. Adora traveled light. She carried her bow, 20 arrows, her machete, dried meat, and water for 3 days, nothing more. She moved faster than Vicente, free from his struggle with unfamiliar land. She read his trail with the skill of someone who had survived for years by understanding the forest's quiet signs. He was trying to hurry, but he did not know the shortcuts. He mistook animal paths for real trails that led nowhere useful. By midday, she had closed the gap to about 2 hours behind him. She reached him at dusk as he set camp near a stream. He had built a small fire, confident he was far enough away to be safe. Adora watched from hiding as he ate and prepared to sleep, feeling a strange mix of anger at his betrayal, pity for the fear that drove him, and cold focus on what had to be done. In another life, they might have stood together against the same enemy. In this one, he had chosen a path that endangered 70 lives, including 13 children. She waited until darkness fully settled and his breathing slowed into sleep. Then she moved silently into the camp, knife ready. As she stood over him, prepared to cut his throat as she once had Colonel Costa, Vicente's eyes opened. Maybe instinct warned him, or maybe he was never fully asleep. His hand shot out and seized her wrist, and suddenly they were on the ground, struggling for control of the blade. Vicente was stronger than Adewora had expected, his body shaped by years of hard plantation labor before his escape. They rolled across the ground, locked in a brutal fight, the outcome still uncertain. The campsite fell into a strained and fearful silence, each person afraid to make even the smallest sound that could draw unwanted attention from somewhere deeper in the forest. The knife spun away from them and vanished into the dark, and the struggle turned brutal and direct. It was no longer about weapons, but about bodies colliding, fists striking, fingers scratching for eyes, knees slamming toward any weak spot they could find. Adewora felt her grandmother's teachings rise inside her, moving through her muscles without thought. These were skills handed down across generations of fighters who knew that staying alive sometimes demanded harsh and ugly actions. She managed to roll on top, her hands locking around Vicente's throat as she forced all her weight down onto him. He kicked and twisted beneath her, his face slowly changing color as his breath was cut off, his hands grabbing wildly at her arms. For a long moment they stared at each other, eyes locked, and Adewora saw something in his face that almost shattered her will. There was fear, of course, but also a pleading look, a desperate wish that she might spare him in a world that had shown mercy to neither of them. But mercy meant risking 70 lives. It meant gambling the future of children against the choice of one broken man. Aurora pressed harder, ignoring the tears running down her cheeks, holding steady until Vicente's movements weakened and then stopped completely. She stayed there for another full minute to be sure, then finally let go and rolled away, her whole body trembling with shock, sorrow, and the terrible understanding of what she had done. She did not bury him or mark the place in any way. She left him to the forest, let the animals and insects take him back into the endless cycle of life and death that existed long before human ideas of right and wrong. She gathered her weapons and supplies, scattered his camp so no trace remained, and started the long walk back toward the settlement. By the time dawn arrived, she was already far away, moving through known paths with the dull focus of Mayoni, who had done what was required and would carry that burden forever. If you have followed Adora's journey to this point, we ask you to pause and like this video and subscribe to our channel. Stories of resistance and survival like this deserve to be shared and remembered. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. How do we respect those who fought for freedom while still recognizing the impossible choices they faced? Your support helps us continue bringing these hidden histories into the light. The settlement greeted her return with quiet relief. Haim asked nothing about Vicente's end, reading enough in Adewora's face to know the danger was gone and that the details should remain unspoken. Life returned to its steady patterns, planting and harvesting, hunting and fishing, teaching children and training fighters, the constant labor of protecting freedom in a world built to destroy it. Yet something inside Adora had changed. Killing Vicente followed her in a way that Colonel Costa's death never had. The colonel had been an oppressor, a man who gained wealth from cruelty and used his power to harm others. Vicente had been a victim who became a traitor, someone who escaped slavery only to endanger his own people. The clear sense of right and wrong that had carried Adora through her escape slowly blurred into a deeper understanding. She saw how oppression twisted everyone it touched, and how survival sometimes forced people to resemble the very enemies they resisted. She began spending long hours near the edge of the forbidden zone, sitting quietly in meditation where human struggles felt small compared to older and deeper forces. The Tupanar elders noticed this change and one evening approached her, led by a shaman named Tupar, who rarely spoke with the Quilombola settlers. "You carry death inside you," he said simply in Portuguese. "Not the death you caused, which is the natural path of warriors. You carry the death of hope, the poison of doubt, and this is far more dangerous than any armed group." Tupar led a cleansing ritual using smoke from sacred plants and chants spoken in a language older than Portuguese rule, perhaps older than human life in the forest itself. Adora joined the ceremony with doubt that slowly softened into something else, not full belief, but an acceptance that some truths existed beyond her understanding, forces larger than any single human story. The ritual did not erase her guilt or questions, but it created room around them, allowing her to carry those feelings without being destroyed by them. Years passed. The settlement grew strong, forming trade ties with other Quilombos and indigenous groups, building a quiet network of resistance hidden beneath colonial power. Adora trained a new generation of warriors, teaching not only how to fight, but why they fought. She told them that freedom was never given, only taken, that survival required both strength and judgment, and that violence, when unavoidable, must never become careless or cruel. She warned them using Vicente's betrayal as a lesson about how desperation could rot trust and how important it was to question loyalties. "Not everyone who escaped slavery wants the same future," she told them. "Some want freedom, some want revenge, and others want only safety and will trade their values to get it." Knowing the difference could mean the life or death of the entire community. News slowly traveled through their hidden network about changes in the colonial world. The Portuguese crown faced growing pressure to end slavery, not out of kindness, but because of shifting economics and politics. Britain had already ended the slave trade and used its navy to force others to follow. Brazil's economy was slowly moving away from sugar toward coffee, altering labor needs and profits. The system that had enslaved Adora was beginning to fracture, though it would take many more years before it truly collapsed. For those living in the Quilombos, these distant changes offered little comfort. They were still hunted, still at risk of capture and punishment if discovered. The bounty on Adora's head expired after 10 years as colonial records turned to newer concerns, but the danger never fully disappeared. Their freedom lasted only as long as they could defend it, only as long as the forest hid them, only as long as loyalty outweighed betrayal. On the 15th anniversary of her escape from Inenjo Santo Antonio, Adora stood at the highest point of the valley, gazing over the settlement that had become her home. 70 people had grown into nearly 200, spread across 3 connected communities. Children born in freedom were now adults, some raising children of their own. 3 generations living free because people refused to accept chains. She thought of her mother and grandmother, of the Quilombo of her childhood that had been destroyed but whose spirit lived on here. She remembered Colonel Costa dying in his study, Vicente gasping at a lonely campsite, and all the pain and sacrifice that bought these moments of peace. She remembered the white men who had chased her into the jungle 15 years earlier, and how they vanished, not because the forest swallowed them, but because she and others made the cost of pursuit too high. Stories spread through the region, growing into legend, claiming Adora had supernatural protection, that spirits killed any white man foolish enough to follow her into the jungle. The truth was simpler and deeper. She survived through knowledge, stubborn will, violence when needed, and the unity of people who knew that personal freedom meant nothing without shared resistance. As the sun dipped over the Atlantic forest, coloring the canopy in gold and red, Adora allowed herself a brief moment of